launchers. We are here with Stephen Kotler. Stephen, are you ready to launch?
Ready for launch, Captain.
I love it. You know, one of the things that I love about your work is that you've really tapped into something that's extraordinary, and you found a way to give language to it. You've become one of the leaders in talking about flow states and high performance. And now you have this new book, Stealing Fire, which I'm very excited about. You sent me an early release, and I'm really looking forward to sitting down and really diving into that. I'm familiar with your work in The Rise of Superman. Now, you've done something different, because in Superman, you talk about flow and these states of consciousness that we can get in to be exceptional performers. Now, with Stealing Fire, you've done something different. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. It's nice to hear that my work has had an impact. I appreciate that very much. It's nice of you to say. Stealing Fire, probably the easiest way to kind of jump in here is to sort of tell you what we were seeing, my partner Jamie Wheel and myself, who I co-founded the Flow Genome Project with, and sort of the book emerged out of that. And after Rise of Superman came out, we were spending a tremendous amount of time running around the world talking about flow, which is an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and perform our best. It's a non-ordinary state of consciousness, to use kind of the technical term. And didn't matter where we were. We could be with the Navy SEALs. We could be in Silicon Valley. We could be with a Fortune 500 company. After we were done presenting on flow, people were thronging up to us and they were saying, flow is great, but it's a phenomenal tool for high performance. But we're also, our whole team is going to silent meditation retreats on a regular basis, or we're all microdosing with psychedelics to improve our creativity on a regular basis, or we're all going skydiving to produce even more flow on a regular basis. And it went on and on and on. And we started to realize that sort of wherever we looked, people were starting to utilize a full suite of kind of non-ordinary states of consciousness to radically improve performance. And my partner, actually, Jamie Wheel, started to say, hey, this looks a little bit like a revolution. And I, of course, was like, well, not so fast. Let's kind of work the numbers and see what we can find. And the deeper we dug and the more we dug, the bigger this revolution started to grow, until we realized that that was actually an apt term in terms of what's going on in the world today.
I really want to hear a little bit more about how non-ordinary states of consciousness are affecting our productivity.
Well, let's back all the way up to William James. William James was a Harvard psychologist, philosopher, physiologist, physician, considered by many kind of the founder of kind of American psychology. And in 1902, William James noticed, he had been doing like a 30-year global study of what he called, quote unquote, mystical experiences, which was his catch-all term for a whole bunch of different altered states of consciousness. By his definition, the term referred to everything from awe and flow states to meditative and contemplative states to psychedelic states to things that if we don't call them mystical, we at least call them mysterious, like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, trance states, and the like. And what he noticed way back when is it didn't really matter what technique you were using. It didn't matter if you were talking about a Buddhist monk meditating in a cave, a Midwestern Quaker at a Quaker prayer circle, a shaman on psychedelics, or even a philosopher having a kind of a moment of aha insight. The feeling produced, sort of the F of the ineffable, was very similar, and that feeling had real impact. He pointed out way back then that, first of all, in these states, they seem to unlock incredible levels of insight, intuition, inspiration, creative problem solving, take your pick. And afterwards, people were fundamentally different. Their lives were richer. They had more meaning. They felt more alive. These states seemed to heal trauma, reduce anxiety, a whole host of stuff like that. And it turns out James was exactly right. And we've spent really the past 100 years proving that to ourselves over and over and over again. I think it is safe to say that the fact that altered states of consciousness are incredibly good for us has become one of the most well-proven facts in psychology. it's backed up by 50 years of data from neuroscience and, 30 years of data from a half a dozen other sciences.
Is there a common thread between an altered state and what creates the most productivity? Or is it really individualistic? Does it depend on who the person is, what state works best for them?
Well, so first I want to back up. Productivity is a funny word. For example, we know because McKinsey did a 10-year study on top executives, that top executives in a flow state are 500% more productive than normal. Now, what is actually under the hood of that productivity? Where does that come from? That's an interesting question. Productivity is a very weird thing to measure. A lot of people argue it's accelerated learning, it's heightened creative problem solving, it's heightened motivation. All of those things, whether it's learning, creative problem solving, or motivation, all of those things are heightened by all the states of consciousness we're talking about. And there's a reason, by the way. This isn't just a grab bag of states of consciousness, even though it sounds like one. What we've discovered over the past really 10 to 12 years as neuroscience has really started to come of age is that when you dig under the hood of these experiences, they really are roughly the same experiences. The same kind of knobs and levers in the brain are being tweaked. So it's not one-to-one, but it's roughly the same. Now, with that said, to get to your question, does this stuff differ individual to individual? I think so, right? And a lot of people seem to think so. What we know about genetics seems to suggest that is true. What we know about the nurture side of the argument or the epigenetic side of the argument also seems to suggest it's true. But I don't know if anybody's exactly looked at it, especially under the question of productivity as you phrased it. So it's a cautious yes to your question, but I want to try for some accuracy, especially at the start of this conversation. I think that's important.
One of the reasons I ask that is, I'm always looking for the way that I perform the best, where I actually can tap into those flow states and get the most done and in the most enjoyable way possible, right? So, one thing that I really found works well for me is I use coffee in a controlled way. I take one shot of espresso with a really epic, deeply emotional playlist and a very busy environment. And I combine those three things, and that's where I get the most productivity, where I can really get into those states for long periods of time. But that's not going to work for everyone, right? So I'm just curious, what other ways have you found that maybe we could all try to alter our state to increase productivity?
Well, if you're aiming directly at productivity, specifically, on a certain level, you're aiming at flow, but let's sort of start at the beginning and talk about why your exact hack happens to work for you. Coffee's a focusing mechanism, raises energy, drives focus, actually drives some of the same neurobiological changes that the altered states that we're talking about drives, sort of primes you. The playlist, and we talk about this at length in Stealing Fire, there's all kinds of amazing research on music's ability to shift consciousness. Does everything from change brain waves to drive neurochemical release to change kind of which parts of the brain are active. So especially, I'm assuming that you're putting on headphones in your own little private playlist world, right? You're doing a couple things there. Not only are you using music as a state-altering technology, but you're also blocking out the world, right? The research consistently shows that the most important thing for creativity or for productivity is shut off your phone, shut off social media, turn off everything that could possibly distract you, and really focus. And, the research shows, by the way, that you have to really focus on singular tasks for 90 minutes to 120 minutes, depending on who you look at. If you're really trying to do something creative, a number of people, including I think Tim Ferriss, has lobbied for 4-hour windows. I've heard a lot of people talking about that sort of thing. So for starters, just kind of digging under the hood of what you're doing, all those things are important. Now, anything that kind of enhances any of those things. So people who practice mindfulness or meditation, phenomenal focus training, right? Not only does it actually alter consciousness as a practice, but it also is tremendous focus training for flow, right? So you can use mindfulness practices, respiration practices as training for focus, which drives flow. So there's a lot of ways in, really depending on who you are and how you are. There are 20 different flow triggers. If you go to my website, stephenkotler.com, you can sign up for my email newsletter and you'll get a free PDF breakdown of all the triggers and how they work. And the easiest way, and what we've seen over and over and over with top performers, is they build their lives around these triggers.
I really like that that you're talking about triggers, and it reminds me of in college. The way that I studied was I tried to study in environments that were quite similar to being in the classroom, because after hearing one of my teachers talk about high performance during tests, and it was something that I used to really struggle with. Anytime I had a test, I used to just start sweating. I'd get very nervous. I'd get anxious, and I wouldn't do that well. So I really tried to kind of hack into that process and become better at test taking, which I did end up getting a lot better. And one of the things that I was told is that if you can study in an environment that is similar to that of where you'll be taking your test, that'll help you and it'll help you zone in. So unlike Kamla, I didn't go to really busy places. I actually went to places that were a lot like classrooms. And I also tried to study in 2-hour block periods as well.
You're talking about state-dependent learning, which is right, the idea that you wear blue sweats while you study for your MedCats. You should take the MedCats in blue sweats, right? And it sort of works the same with the environment. I actually have done both. When I was in college, even on into grad school, I wrote in very, very, very noisy bars. In fact, my first novel, The Angler's Flight, I wrote the first draft of it sitting in a bar because I lived very far away from campus. And so I would, I rather than, and I was a bartender. So rather than go home, I would often, post up in a corner of the bar that I was working in, work for 4 or 5 hours on my book, and then get up and tend bar for a couple hours. So that, I have found, that works for me. It works for a lot of people. I think Malcolm Gladwell does all his work in public. A bunch of other people I've heard of do it as well. But state-dependent learning, works remarkably well. It even works with altered states of consciousness. This is an interesting random detail, but one of the things that's kind of come out of the study of marijuana, and one of the reasons people tend to miss that marijuana can really function as a performance enhancing drug, is because marijuana, and really maybe this is anandamide, which is the neurochemical underneath marijuana that is so effective. It's also there in flow. Tends to prefer sort of state-specific learning. So what happens in high school is people get into high school and they start smoking pot with their friends and eating Cheetos and watching movies. And what they're training their brain to do, once stoned, is eat Cheetos and watch movies. So they're never realizing that if you actually train the brain to focus and be creative and write poetry or et cetera, you're actually looking at a state-changing, performance-enhancing drug. And I think, personal opinion here, maybe a bit of a volatile one, but I absolutely believe one of the reasons that we're seeing kind of marijuana legalization sweeping the country is more and more people seem to be using it as a performance enhancing drug. There's all kinds of stories leaking out of Silicon Valley about how they're having problems with this kind of new kind of smoke break. Employees are dashing outside to get stoned and coming back and they're more productive. And what exactly do you do?
That's a hard one for bosses to manage, or for them to figure out the answer. And, it was actually, there's kind of a rumor among English literature graduates that Shakespeare smoked pot as well. So it's kind of an interesting little thing out there. She doesn't buy that, but I don't know about buying these, but all I know is the guy invented like a third of the English language. That's right. Which is really amazing considering how many people had their crack at English before Shakespeare came along. And the dude just invented so many words. It's astounding. We'll have quite a conversation if we open that conversation up. That is part of my flow state, is talking about literature and English literature and writers. I absolutely love it. So, one of the things that I'm curious about, because I know that in your book, your new book, Stealing Fire, you talk about these altered states and how it's a like creating, you called it like a $1 trillion industry or something earlier before the interview. And I'm
Yes.
I'm curious about that. If you can tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Absolutely. So when we were researching flow, we had to put together a giant list of every bit of neuroscience surrounding flow. Where did it come from? What could possibly be triggering in the brain and the body? And by the time we were done, because flow is an altered state of consciousness and it sits, sort of in a spectrum with a lot of other altered states of consciousness, we started to see patterns, right? We started to see that the knobs and levers underpinning these states were the same. And we used, and this also, we were looking at very specific things, right? In all these states, they have a number of things in common, but the two things they really share is the self tends to disappear, right? We switch the channel on normal waking consciousness and the self tends to vanish. And simultaneously, we're filled with kind of inspiration, insight, and intuition. Those characteristics underpin all these states. And what we started to realize, and it grew out of this funny conversation that we were having with Salim Ismail, who was the first executive president of Singularity University, sort of a Silicon Valley fixture. And we were talking about flow. And he said, it's funny if you think about it, whenever you go to a live concert or a sporting event, you're essentially paying to see people in flow, right? If you buy a ticket to go see the Lakers a couple of years ago, you didn't want to go see the Lakers. You wanted to see Kobe Bryant, Revenge of the Black Mamba, so in the zone he was dropping 50, right? That's what you were actually paying money for. He said it's the same thing when you go to the movies. You're paying to see actors in flow, poetry readings, poets in flow, on and on and on. He said if you quantify it, I'll bet it's a huge chunk of the GDP. And this always stuck in my head. And when Jamie and I were kind of running around the country and seeing all these other people utilizing altered states of consciousness, all of these other kinds of altered states of consciousness, it got us curious. We decided we wanted to start to put some numbers around it. How much money do people spend trying to like turn off the voice in their head and unlock this level of inspiration? And we had the neurobiology underneath the processes. And using this screen, it allowed us to kind of filter across different domains in society. And we started to make a calculation of how much money people were spending on this stuff. And we looked at, both kind of every which way people could possibly going about altering their consciousness. And we called it the altered state economy. So, we started with the really obvious, like the $2.3 trillion people spend on illicit drugs. Right. And then the 182 billion people spend on psychoactive pharmaceuticals. But we also looked at all the things people try to alter their state of consciousness. So psychology, coaching, self-help, not really like skills acquisition training, but we focused on anything that was help me change the channel in my head, help me feel better. We added that numbers in. We were also trying to be really conservative. So, for example, pretty much whenever we go to a live music event, we're hunting state change, right? We're hunting that losing myself in the music, losing myself in the band, losing myself in the crowd, the feeling we call communitas. But we said, okay, that's maybe too big for us. Maybe there are other reasons, right? People go to see concerts. So we focused in instead on electronic dance music, where you're not going to the concert to see the band because there isn't one. You're not going to hear the lyrics because there aren't any. What there are is, thumping beats, a colossal light show, lots of state-changing technology, lots of trance dancing. It's about the state of consciousness. So by adding all this together, what we discovered is that globally, we spend roughly $4 trillion trying to change our consciousness every year. Now, that is a colossal number. It is larger than the GDP of India or England or Russia. It's roughly the GDP of Germany. It's 25% of the U.S. economy. Or, if you want to be poetic about it, it's a number twice as high as the amount of galaxies in the sky.
Before we close out, I'm really curious about, are there any tips that you want the thriving launchers to walk away with on how to access these states?
Well, how is a matter of choice? So let me answer that by putting things in context. For example, let's talk about non-ordinary states and their ability to kind of heal trauma, okay? And relieve anxiety, cure depression, heal trauma. And let's, as an example, use kind of the worst case of trauma you can imagine, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. So the only real treatments for PTSD that are available to most people are either talk therapy or SSRIs. Talk therapy has been shown to be generally ineffective and occasionally makes things worse. SSRIs don't really work for most people. And for the people that they do work for, they don't work in really severe cases. So the people who need the most help can't get it. Over the past 10 years, 3 different studies on 3 different kind of techniques for altering consciousness were put to the test. Michael Mitherhofer, a psychologist from South Carolina, looked at MDMA, the psychoactive inside of ecstasy, and talk therapy as a cure for PTSD. And what he discovered is that as little as 1 to 3 sessions with MDMA was enough to overwrite PTSD in Iraq and Afghani war veterans and victims of sexual abuse and child abuse. Amazing finding, astounding finding. A couple years later, they repeated that same study at Camp Pendleton in California. This time, instead of using a psychedelic to trigger a non-ordinary state of consciousness, they relied on surfing plus talk therapy. Surfing is a reliable flow trigger. It's essentially the same protocol they used with MDMA with surfing substituted. What they found is 5 weeks of surfing was enough to pretty much overwrite PTSD and get people off their meds. They then reran that same experiment with meditation, and they found that 1 month of meditation produced the same results. So what you have is 3 different techniques with 3 different levels of risk and 3 different time scales available. So though it's really a question of how much risk do you want to take personally and professionally, and what's your time scale? Do you want it now? Are you willing to wait a long time? As a general rule, you can go A to B faster, but you have to try something riskier along the way. You can get there a lot slower, same place, same outcome, but, less risk. So, as far as tips and tricks, if you want, please go to my website, sign up for my emails and newsletter, go to the flowgenomeproject.com and take our free flow profile, which is exactly what you're looking for. It's a traitology. It says if you're this kind of person, you're likely to find the most flow in these directions. Those are resources that are available to everybody for free. For a kind of a longer, detailed, really drawn out look, you can take a look at The Rise of Superman or Bold or Stealing Fire. So it's out there.
Those are all great resources, and Thriving Launchers, we have that for you at our website. If you wrote down or you're in front of your computer, go ahead and visit Stephen's websites now. Feel free to do so. But also, if you don't worry about it. We have everything over on our resources over on our website. Stephen, I was hoping that you were going to give me a reason that doing drugs was going to be okay, but the moral of the story is don't do drugs. You can have it the safe way through meditation or surfing.
If that's the moral you want to go towards, bless you. Absolutely. You are doing a better job than my publicist.
I think that the message was a little misconstrued there. I just want to say as a testament to this, I started off at a young age real quick that I did a lot of hallucinogens. I smoked weed. I drank alcohol and all of that. Then I decided to quit all that and really go into deep realms of altering consciousness with meditation, breath, movement, and those kind of things. And I found that actually I was able to sustain those states for longer periods of time with more clarity. And so there's my little plug into not doing drugs.
Towards that end, the thing I'll leave you with is that's really what the research is showing, is that combining these techniques, whatever it is, right? As a writer, I spend a lot of time combining, action sports as triggers for flow with kind of, long periods of intense concentration when I'm writing. I bounce back and forth, and one feeds the other, and I have a meditation practice and a yoga practice, and, on and on. And I think that's true with high performers everywhere. I think one of the clearest findings of the 21st century is that to unlock the skills we want most, creativity, collaboration, cooperation, reduced anxiety, take your pick. The reason we're so bad at this stuff is we've been sort of going at them trying to train up skills, and what we really need to be training is states of mind.
We've been here with Stephen Kotler talking about altered states of consciousness affecting productivity and living better lives, really. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Keep thriving.
You've been listening to the Thriving Launch podcast. For books and resources related to today's episode, make sure to head over to thrivinglaunch.com. We'll see you there.